You probably know the Salton Sea as the dead one. The toxic lake out in the California desert, ringed by abandoned motels and dead fish. What almost nobody tells you is how it got there. It was born in a single accident in 1905, when the Colorado River broke loose and started pouring north into the desert, and it refused to be stopped. It took the most powerful railroad in the country almost 2 years, 300 borrowed rail cars, and a load of rock dumped into that river every 7 minutes, day and night. And for 100 years, everybody near Yuma has sworn they know what it cost. Dozens of locomotives still buried out there today. So we checked, and the most famous story about this place is wrong. Let us deal with the locomotives first, because that is the story you will hear in every diner from Yuma to Brawley. The version where the railroad got so desperate that they ran whole trains out over the break and dumped them in, engines and all, and that those engines are still down there in the riverbed today. We went looking for that. We went into the sworn testimony of the man who actually closed the breach, an engineer named Harry Corey, and into the account written by George Kennan, who was standing there while it happened. And in the official record, the one written by the people who were on the rock trains, there is not a single lost locomotive. Not one. The rolling stock was borrowed, it was expensive, and when the fight was over, they sent it back. So if the famous story is wrong, the real one has to answer a harder question. Because something out there cost a railroad more than $3 million, shut down 1,200 miles of its own main line, and nearly drowned an entire American valley. And the truth of what these machines actually did is stranger than any buried engine. To understand it, we have to go back to the cut that started everything. Here is the part that should not have been possible. The Salton Sea sits in a basin called the Salton Sink, a stretch of desert that sits below sea level, more than 200 feet below it at the bottom. For thousands of years, the Colorado River had wandered back and forth across its own delta, sometimes draining to the Gulf, sometimes swinging north to fill that sink and make a lake, then drying out again. The land was some of the richest farmland in the country if you could just get water onto it. So in 1901, a private company cut a canal off the Colorado and brought the water in, and the desert turned green. Towns went up. 12,000 settlers moved into a place they started calling the Imperial Valley. But the Colorado carries silt, an enormous amount of it, and the canal kept clogging. So in the fall of 1904, the engineers did something to keep the water moving. They cut a new intake straight into the bank of the river, just south of the border in Mexico, and they did it without a control gate, because the gate was going to take time, and approval they did not have. It was a shortcut. It was going to be temporary. Then the winter floods came, and the river found that open cut, and it liked it. By the summer of 1905, the entire Colorado River was no longer flowing to the sea. It had turned through that ungated cut, and it was pouring north into the Salton Sink at a rate that is hard to picture. At its peak, the break was passing more than 90,000 cubic feet of water every second. Kennan did the arithmetic and called it a rush of 360 million cubic feet of water per hour, running downhill into a basin big enough to hold Long Island Sound. And it was not just filling a lake. The water pouring over the edge of that sink was cutting backward. Every day, the falling water chewed the soft silt upstream, and a waterfall formed and began marching back toward the canals and the towns. It started about 15 feet high. It grew to 80. In some places, the gorge cut backward 4,000 feet in a single day. The settlers did the math nobody wanted to say out loud. The same river they had invited in to save them from the desert was now going to cut the head off their own canal. And then they would lose the water. And then they would be driven out by thirst before they were ever driven out by the flood. The little company that started all this was bankrupt and out of its depth. And the only outfit in the West with the money, the men, and the rolling stock to even attempt this was the railroad whose own tracks were now sinking under the rising sea. The Southern Pacific. This is where the scale of it turns, because closing this break was not a construction job. It was a war against a live river, and the railroad knew that if it lost, it did not just lose a valley. The rising water was already swallowing its main line east to west. The town of Salton, a railroad siding built around a salt works that harvested 700 tons of salt a day, was going under. Calexico and Mexicali, the towns on the border, were partly washed away. A salt company downstream had its entire operation buried under 60 feet of water. And the man who had to authorize the fight was Edward Harriman, the most powerful railroad baron in America, who controlled the Southern Pacific. The decision to spend the railroad's own fortune fixing a private company's mistake landed on his desk in the spring of 1906. In the same weeks, the city of San Francisco was still smoking from the earthquake. Corey later said that was the most remarkable thing in the whole story, that Harriman committed the money while his own railroad was buried in the ruins of a destroyed city. He gave the order, turn the river back, whatever it takes. And what it took had never been done before. Most of the best engineers in the country said it could not be done at all, that you could not stop a river that size with the only tool the railroad actually had. If you want to see the gamble they made, and the technique they stole from the people who had lived on that river for 1,000 years, hit the like button and subscribe, because what happens next is the part the history books skip. Let us get into it. The railroad's plan was simple to say and almost impossible to do. They would build a dam across a break in a live river by running rail cars out on a trestle and dumping rock into the water faster than the river could carry it away. The rock came in cars the crews called battleships, big steel side dump gondolas, 300 of them, borrowed from the Union Pacific. And here is a detail that tells you how desperate this was. Those same battleship cars had been bought years earlier to build the railroad causeway straight across the Great Salt Lake. Cars built to fill in a lake were now being used to plug a river that was busy making one. But the first attempts failed, and they failed for a reason nobody expected. They would dump a trainload of boulders into the break, and the boulders would simply vanish. The riverbed under the break was not rock or even hard clay. It was fine silt, soft as quicksand, and the rock sank into it and disappeared, and the river kept running as if nothing had happened. So they tried something that did not come out of an engineering textbook. It came from the river itself. When the railroad could not hire the hundreds of laborers it needed out of Mexico, Corey turned to the people who already knew this water. He brought in the desert tribes, the Cocopa, the Quechan, the Pima, the Maricopa, families and all, around 2,000 people who made a camp of their own at the worksite. And they brought a technique that had been used on that river for centuries. They wove the riverbank itself into a net. They cut arrowweed and willow, the same plants those tribes used for their homes and their baskets, and they bound it with steel cable and baling wire into enormous mattresses. Then they sank those brush mattresses onto the bed of the river, from bank to bank, a double layer about 100 feet wide. And the mattress held the silt down. Now when the boulders came off the cars, They landed on the woven mat instead of vanishing into the muck. The rock finally had something to grab. Without that, none of the machines mattered. The railroad could have owned every rail car in America, and the river would have swallowed all of it. The thing that made the rock dam possible was a fence woven out of desert brush by the people the history books almost never name. And we want to be straight with you about something, because this channel lives on getting it right. The popular story says this flood was a pure accident, a careless mistake that created the sea. The geologists who have studied that basin will tell you it is not that simple, that the Colorado had filled that sink on its own many times over thousands of years, and would have again. We will come back to what that means at the end. If you are the kind of person who would rather have the real version than the easy one, you are in the right place. Now back to the river, because the railroad was about to think it had won, and then lose everything. By November of 1906, they did it. They closed the break. The first dam held, the river was forced back toward its old channel, and the word went out that the Colorado was finally beaten. The crews packed up. People went home. For about a month, the most powerful river in the Southwest did what it was told. Then, in early December, a flood came down a tributary called the Gila, and it was one of the largest floods that river had ever carried. It hit the fresh, barely settled dam, and it tore the whole thing open again. Everything they had done was gone in a matter of days, and it happened so fast that it nearly killed the men working downstream. When the river blew back through, the crews south of the breaks were cut off, surrounded by water that had not been there hours before. The railroad sent a steamboat, the Searchlight, to pull them out. And in one of those details you could not make up, the river was shifting its bed so violently that the rescue boat ran aground on a stretch of riverbed that had been dry land that morning and was now the middle of a moving river. They got the men out. But the lesson was brutal. They were not fighting a construction problem. They were fighting something alive, and it had just shrugged off the best they had. So they came back angry. And this time, they came back with everything. Harriman gave the order to stop treating it like a budget. For 3 weeks, 2 entire divisions of the Southern Pacific, about 1,200 miles of main line, were tied up almost completely. Crack passenger trains were shoved onto sidings so that trains of rock could get through. The railroad pulled stone from quarries up and down the west. Some of it hauled 485 miles, from as far away as Patagonia, Arizona, over 2 mountain passes, to reach the break. They built not 1 trestle, but 2, on 90-foot pilings driven down into the river, and the river fought them for it. 3 separate times in a single month, the current ripped the 90-foot piles out and swept the trestles away, and 3 separate times the pile drivers went back in and built them again. On the 4th attempt, the trestle held, and then came the number that I think about every time I see this story. Once that final trestle was standing, the rock trains ran around the clock, and they dumped 1 full carload of rock into that break every 7 minutes, day and night, for 15 straight days. Great searchlights lit the water, so the work never stopped after dark. Large boulders were broken with small charges of dynamite laid right on the stone, so the whole site sounded like artillery. Crew relieved crew without a break in the dumping. Stop and picture that for a second. A rail car of boulders into a living river every 7 minutes for 2 weeks straight until the river finally gave up. When it was over, the totals were almost hard to believe. The final closing alone took 1,517 battleship cars of rock, 2,052 cars of gravel, 956 cars of clay, and over 1,000 more flat cars of large stone. And the flood that all of this was fighting had carved out the land on a scale that beats the most famous dig in the world. By Corey's own measurement, the earth the runaway river tore loose and moved was nearly 4 times the total amount of dirt excavated to build the entire Panama Canal. On the 10th of February, 1907, the Colorado was forced back into its old bed for good. 52 days after Harriman gave the final order. 15 days after the first battleship load of rock came off that last trestle. So now we come back to the locomotives, to the dozens of buried engines that everybody near Yuma has sworn were down there for 100 years. We told you the official record does not have them, and it does not. But here is the small piece of truth that grew into the legend. There was a wreck. Back during the fight, one of those hastily built trestles settled under the weight of a loaded train. 3 of the wooden support frames sank, and the rock train on it went down. Corey's own photograph of it survives, and he labeled it simply the wrecked battleship. 1 car, clearly documented. The train wrecked, and in his words, it was fortunate that no one was seriously hurt. That is the seed. 1 trestle, 1 wreck, 1 wrecked car, photographed and written down. And over 100 years of retelling in valley diners, 1 wrecked rail car became dozens of buried locomotives still down there in the dark. The machines did not die in that river. They won, and the railroad counted them and sent them home. It was not a machine that failed out there. It was a gate, a cut, a shortcut taken in a hurry in the fall of 1904. The machines are the reason there is still an Imperial Valley to drive through at all. And that brings us to the strangest part of the whole thing. The men on those rock trains spent 2 years, a fortune, and very nearly their lives forcing the Colorado back into its bed. But the geologists who study that basin will tell you that the river had filled that sink before, on its own, many times across thousands of years, and that what these men were really fighting was not a freak accident. It was the river doing something it had always done, just at the worst possible moment for the people who had moved in. The Salton Sea. You see today, the dying one, the one with the dead fish and the empty motels, is what is left of that fight. The water they could not push all the way out. It is shrinking now, and it is becoming its own kind of disaster. But it sits there as the proof of one thing. The most powerful railroad in America went to war with a river, and the rock trains won, 1 carload every 7 minutes, until it was done. If your father or your grandfather ever worked a rock train or a rail line, tell us in the comments, because those are the men who did this. And if you want the real story behind the next machine the history books got wrong, subscribe, because we go looking every time. We checked this one. Now you know what it really cost.